Today we are going to explore the question of how fast do organisms really change over time. Specifically, your learning targets, you're still working on this idea of natural selection, being able to construct an explanation based on evidence for how genetic variations increase some probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment, but also using a little bit of mathematical representation here to explain how increase and decreases of traits in a population do lead to natural selection. Let's begin. So there's basically two ways that living things can change over time. This diagram here is called a cladogram, and you may see those as we work our way through the rest of this unit. It just shows relationships between one kind of animal to another. The first way we're going to talk about is gradualism. So gradualism, if you know what gradual means, it means very slow. It is the very slow change of one species to another new species over thousands or millions of years. So it's named because of the pace. It's very slow. The other feature about this is that you show or see in the fossil record intermediate forms of the species. That means in between stages. So for instance, if we look at these horses as an example, this is what we know as the modern horse. The horse didn't always look like that. If we go through the fossil record, we see other horses, and the first horse-like organism was this Eohippus. Okay, so we know that the horse species in general, changed into different species over the millennia. The other example, or we'll get into horses a little bit more in a second, but the other example we'll talk about is whales. So more on horses. Here's the early horses called Eohippus, and the fossils tell us that those were around about 55 million years ago. And if you look at their foot, you can really see they have 4 toes. Okay, and as time passes, as the millions of years pass, 40 million years ago we had this Mesohippus, where at this point had lost one of those toes, so now it had 3 and it's a bit bigger. 25 million years ago, we had this Merychippus horse, and by this time it had 3 toes, but those toes were really far stretched out, and again, the horse was bigger. And then by 5 million years ago, we had the Pleiohippus, and by that time, no toes, just 1 hoof, as we would call them today, and about the same size, a little bit bigger. And now we have this modern day Equus horse, and the bottom of its foot, the hoof, is a little bit broader, still no more toes. So you might think about what were the advantageous characteristics for a horse to evolve in that way. Think about perhaps maybe it could run faster. With the absence of those toes, it made it a better runner to escape predators. The size also probably made it more intimidating. Some things to consider. We don't know for sure. Here's another chart that shows us the evolutionary change in horses. So here's millions of years ago. And on this side, we're looking at body size. So just showing us the comparison of body size between the different species of horses. So as time has passed, the horse has gotten bigger. Whales are another one we will spend a little bit more time talking about, but whales actually come from a land animal, if you didn't know that. And if we look through the fossil record, here's the intermediate forms that we think existed. So here's most like what our current whales look like. Whales have the remnant of a pelvis and hind limb, and they would call that a Basilosaurus. Going back farther in time, there was even more of a pelvis and hind limb, Rhodocetus. You guys will see more about this in another video. And then, sorry, that was Durodon. Rhodocetus was predominantly aquatic, but had full-on hips and legs. And same with Pakicetus, which was a land animal. So more on whale evolution in a future lesson. Another example might be corn. You guys are used to calling and seeing corn this, which is actually the female part of the corn. This would be the ovary, where each corn kernel is a potential seed that is a fertilized egg. This is the male version of the corn that makes pollen. But corn didn't always look this way. Way back in, before man, corn looked more like this. And people selected for, as we started to grow corn for food, selected for these enhanced ovaries, basically, that make this nice meaty corn that we like to eat. So that's an example of gradualism too. On to our second idea of punctuated equilibrium. Now first I'll just say this is a funny name, which might be hard to understand, but the idea is fairly simple. The idea is that it's just rapid or sudden changes. And when we say rapid or sudden, we just mean tens or a few hundred years, which is short in the span of Earth's history. In a species, by the mutation of just a few genes. So enough genes change that you end up getting a new species, but there are no intermediate forms. Here you can see this in the diagram with the birds. If we start with this medium yellow bird, and just a few genes change and a new species forms that's all red, there was no in-between bird between those two stages. And relatively few genes changed. It's not like the bird grew an extra leg or completely changed the shape of its beak, but enough to create a new species. So bears are another example. We'll see more about this in a second. And bacteria and viruses do this all the time. So let's take a look at the bear example. So again, you can think of the punctuated equilibrium idea as change happening in spurts instead of long, slow, and continuous as in gradualism. So if we look here, there was some ancestral bear that all of these different bears came from, and there were probably points along the way where there was a common ancestor. But for instance, if we just focus in on this part of the diagram, right, all of these bears share that common ancestor, but they're all separate species of bear now. And again, think of our definition of species. They don't mate with each other. Another factor that we think plays a role in punctuated equilibrium is this: major environmental changes in a relatively short period of time. So remember when BrainPop was talking about environmental pressures, right? Things like food supply and climate. So that stuff can change really rapidly, and mutations don't always happen that quickly or randomly. So it might shift in a really short period of time what traits are favorable. So it would be expected that in these kinds of things, long severe droughts, major volcanic eruptions, the beginning and ending of ice ages, would probably trigger some of those rapid changes where you're not seeing an in-between stage. The species is just changing enough to create a new species within a relatively short period of time. Here's another example: viruses and bacteria. They also use punctuated equilibrium. You can create new viruses and bacteria species all the time. So for instance, H. pylori is the bacteria that gives ulcers in your stomach, and the normal version of that produces an enzyme, and when the person takes an antibiotic that would kill that bacteria, it works. The bacteria is killed off. But there can be mutant strains, which are a different species. This one doesn't produce the enzyme, so when the antibiotic is given, nothing happens to it. It just survives and passes on its good genes, good for the bacteria, to make more bacteria. And these are what we call antibiotic resistant bacteria, and it's a major problem in modern medicine. Here's a nice graphic that shows the difference between the two. We're looking at just some kind of fake organism here, and we're comparing the two. We've got gradualism here and punctuated equilibrium here. So in gradualism, we start with a very plain shape, and over time, things get added, in this case, a design, and then appendages, and then curvy appendages. And we see these in-between forms along the way. And when we say time is passing, we're talking about millions of years. But in punctuated equilibrium, a lot of change can happen in a relatively short period of time. So for a while, these little shapes just existed the way they are. But now a few genes mutate all at once, and now you have the design and the curvy legs all at once. And we're talking about tens or 100s in years. Here's a corny science joke for you. Poorly punctuated equilibrium. Here again is another diagram that shows the difference between the two. We've got gradualism over here, punctuated equilibrium over here. See if you can pick out the differences between these two processes. So far, we've talked about what natural selection is, and we want to take a minute and compare that to artificial selection. So maybe you've already noticed that artificial is sort of the opposite of natural selection, right? So here's the definition. It's the process of intentional or sometimes unintentional modification of a species through human action, which generally are choosing or encouraging the breeding of certain traits over others. Sometimes you'll also hear it called selective breeding. So people have definitely done that with dogs, right? They basically created domesticated dogs from a wolf. Or in this case with the cauliflower, they've chosen to grow and breed different colors of cauliflower. Again, dogs technically are all the same species, but the variety that occurs within the species has definitely been helped along the way by humans. It would not be so dramatic of differences from one breed to the next without the influence of humans. Just look at all the variety that we have created within the species of dog. So another example would be crops or decorative plants, right? These are all peppers. People have chosen to breed with different qualities. These are all carrots of different colors. Here's another example. Here's the scientific name. Brassica oleracea is a common wild mustard. And people grew that, but as time has passed, we have selected for different features within that plant. So when we selected for big beefy leaves, we ended up with kale. And if we selected for stems and flowers, then we got broccoli. And when we bred the plants to select for flower clusters, then we got cauliflower. For cabbage, we selected for a terminal bud, a bud that grows at the end of the plant. That gave us cabbage. Brussels sprouts grow along the side of the plant. So cabbage and Brussels sprouts are closely related, but again, the buds grow on the side. And a selection for this very large stem gave us kohlrabi. So all of that is human influenced and has given us all of those different species that we are familiar with today.